Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Groupthink. If this is your first time joining us, Groupthink is one of our dialogue series at CU, where we pick a topic and talk about whatever feels meaningful, all guided by burning questions. So my name is Madison, and I'm a high school senior from Vertis, Oklahoma. And now I'm going to give you guys the floor to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Noor. I'm 16. I'm from Chicago, Illinois.
Hi, my name is Phoebe. I'm 17 and I'm from Dallas, Texas.
Hello, I'm Ashley. I'm also 17 from Vancouver, Washington.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I am likewise 17. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky.
Hey, I'm Maryam. I'm also 17 and I'm from the suburbs of Chicago.
Gary, are you going to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. Great. Of course. I'm Gary Sheng. I'm one of the co-founders of Civics Unplugged. I'm calling in from New York City, where CU is headquartered.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for being here. Today we're talking about intrinsic motivation. So something we're going to do to start off that we started last week is we're going to do word association. So we're going to give you guys a couple minutes to think of 3 words that come to mind when you think of intrinsic motivation, and then we'll go through them together.
And then you're going to screen share, right, Madison?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Madison, why don't you start collecting responses, or whoever is
Okay. Yeah.
whoever has theirs first.
Anyone want to go first?
Sure. Okay, so the first 3 words that came to my mind were driven, purpose, and meaningful.
Okay.
My 3 were like the individual, passion, and wholeheartedly.
I was thinking about curiosity, clarity, and rewards.
I guess I can give my 3. So I thought of optimized, exploratory, and this is a weird one, but car wreck. And I can explain that later after people finish.
You say car wreck?
Car wreck.
Car wreck. Okay.
My 3 were valid, successes, and personal.
Phoebe, did I spell your name right?
It's P-H-O-E-B-E, but you're good.
Okay. And then I had work, fun, rewarding. Okay. Yeah, Zoe, I want to hear more about this.
Yeah. So there's this weird article that I remember reading in middle school because I was doing research about, extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And so there's a story of this man who, when he by mistake hit this young woman when he was driving. And I don't remember what country he was in, but it was widely known that it was cheaper to pay for somebody's funeral than it was to pay for hospital bills. And so people watched in horror as he kept going back and forth because he was motivated more so by the money of having to pay for that than like the life of that person. And so it was a weird case study of like people can be really motivated by money, even though like intrinsically they're aware of like the costs, which I think is just a weird, human behavior.
Wow, that's an incredible story. Like in terms of educational, is that what you said is real?
Yeah, I can try and find it, but it was just like reading it, like I know everyone else was reading it, was like, I can't believe that you would risk going to prison because it was cheaper. But he was that scared of his own financial health being hurt. So that's the decision he made.
Wow.
So I'm wondering, is there a question that comes to anyone's mind thanks to that story?
I have a question. Is intrinsic motivation always inherently good, or is it always, or can it be also bad, or does that depend on perspective?
I like this question a lot because, well, first of all, I guess like good and bad is subjective, like what's good, but I think also it's like intrinsic motivation can be different for people. So like if you're like based on what your priorities are, so if your priority is like you were talking about like your financial health, and like maybe your intrinsic motivation is going to be doing whatever you can to maximize like your money or like minimize your losses. But I think that's a really interesting concept, that like intrinsic motivation, like in my perspective, like coming into this conversation, I guess I was like, oh, that's such a good thing, right? Like if you have intrinsic motivation, it just means that it's motivating you to do things and you're not doing it because anybody else wants you to. But I think it's so interesting to think that like it could be bad depending on like what your interests are, and like not necessarily those interests are bad, but like if you let those interests trump everything else, then it could like get the best of like you, and also could compromise your moralities if you like let it drive you in the wrong direction, I guess. But again, I'm also using like good and bad and like wrong and right, which are subjective terms too. So I guess that is just dependent on what people perceive them as.
I think for me, it like intrinsic. I see intrinsic motivation as like a very like a power tool, where it's like whatever like purpose that, or like whatever goal you want to accomplish, if you have intrinsic motivation to do it, like that's going to be something that helps you. I think it depends on like what your goal is. That like defines that good and bad thing, because I think like assuming that your end goal was something bad, again, like subjectively, like something bad, then I think the intrinsic motivation that comes with it is also bad, because it's propelling you to do something that is bad. But it's like good in the sense that it's still giving you that like harnessing tool to like really push forward. So I guess for me, it just depends on like what you're motivated about.
Noor, something you said really made me think about how like it's not motivation itself that's good or bad, but rather like the end goal. I really like that thought, and that's all I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, it like almost reminds me of like, I mean, like I hear a lot like power isn't good or bad. It's like just a tool to be used. And I think that's almost like the same with like intrinsic motivation. Like it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just all about how you use it, and like it just comes down to like what your values are and like what exactly your goal is.
It's almost like, is it like justified? Like is like what you're feeling inside, like that push forward, is that justified for like almost like do the means justify the ends, I guess, but like in terms of intrinsic motivation.
I'll say I agree that it definitely depends on the end goal, but I think in and of itself, like the ability to be motivated by something just because you want it, I think is really amazing. Like, I mean, there are people who I mean, money will get them to do something. And I know for me that there are things where like, oh, you're going to buy me food? You know, I'll do that. But for things where like you just internally really want to do something, that's awesome. Now it can be, as we said, yielded in very, unfortunate ways. But I think it's kind of a phenomenon in and of itself.
Do you like think back to your story though, and like wondering like, is that really intrinsic motivation though, that the guy wanted to like felt like he needed to run over that person? Because like I don't know, but I want to believe no one is naturally like intrinsically motivated to do that. I feel like there are external pressures or like external beliefs that have like shaped that person's perspective, and like, so I don't know, it's not like intrinsically the person is super evil, it's just externally there are things going on.
Yeah, and then I agree with you. I think in that particular instance, which is like a pretty morbid example in all honesty, but I mean, that person was seriously concerned for like their financial well-being. And like those external factors outweighed any, just natural humanity factors. Be like, oh no, I don't want to, hurt this person more than I have to. So I think that I mean, we don't have to go to this question next, but it could be something just to look at, like what influences people more, like intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. And then like, I think that those are two different motivators that can make people do very different things.
I mean, I think we can go. Do you guys want to go to that question? I think it's a good question.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first thing that like comes to mind isn't necessarily like an answer, but another question, which is like, how do you define intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? Because I think that shapes like which one. I definitely think it's like a case by case basis of like which one is more impactful. But I think it depends on like the definition.
Yeah, I think we can start with that. I was gonna ask that as well. So like, what is extrinsic motivation, or what are both of them? Like, what did you ask? Sorry.
Like, how do you define extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation?
Yeah.
I'll say that the only reason that I like remotely know what this is because I actually did a research project on it in 8th grade after reading that article. And so how I look at it is that extrinsic motivation is anything where like someone else or something else has to give you something for you to want to do something. So like, and so that can be a lot of things of like, if your parents are like, I'm gonna take away your car keys if you don't do your chores, that's extrinsic because you want to be able to drive. So you would, do whatever your parents said to do. And in a way, like doing schoolwork is kind of mixed. Like, is that extrinsic? Is it intrinsic? Because you want good grades and you want to go to a good school because with those good grades. But I think intrinsic is like internal, like something that you want to do and something that you would do even if like no one else told you to do it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think a lot about like rewards. Like I feel like, like extrinsic motivation is like essentially like you doing things for a reward that comes from like the outside world, like someone else gives you the reward. But like when you're intrinsically motivated, like you are able to create your own rewards for yourself instead of having to depend on someone else for it.
And something to add on to that, I think both are valued differently. Like coming back to like how Zoe was using the example of school, like from a global perspective, because that's how my school is set up. Like we have to think of everything and bring it back to like a global example. Intrinsic value is more something that we have to come up with like ourselves. And I mean, that's literally in the definition, but it's not as pushed as an extrinsic motivation. Like good grades equal scholarships for college, equal degree, equal a good life. Like it's very cookie cutter, and I feel like that's how I've just been taught to think. But then intrinsic motivation would be to want to think in a different way. And to be able to do that, you would have to be surrounded by people who also value that and who also want to change their way of thinking. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I do think that they hold different values in society as a whole.
Yeah, I like that point. I think a good way to assess intrinsic motivation is like, would you still be doing it if like no one knew you were doing it at all? Like if you were like almost like doing it in secret, like would you still get the same fulfillment out of it?
I think like Phoebe, something that you said also like made me think of something. Like I think that there's like a lot of nuance when it comes to like extrinsic motivation because it's like, oh, if there's not like a physical reward, but it's maybe like, oh, someone else will be happy if you do something, like where does that fall on the spectrum? Because you intrinsically want them to be happy about it, or like you want them to feel a certain way, but also like it's not coming from yourself. So I think that that's something like interesting to think about, like where the line is between like extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. And I also think that like, is it still intrinsic motivation if you want to do it, but there still is like an extrinsic reward? Like it's like, oh, do you want to do it for yourself or do you want to do it for that reward? I guess like, I don't know, for some people for like college, they're like, oh, like I want to like succeed in the traditional system just to prove that I can. But some people also might say like, oh no, that's like extrinsic because you know, you're doing it to like follow like the traditional path of life. So I don't know, I think that at least for me it's something that I'm thinking about. I'm like, oh, like what really like defines the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic when it comes down to those like smaller things.
So let me pose two questions that Madison, can you like add it to the question kind of list related to Maryam's points? Can intrinsic motivation be corrupted by extrinsic rewards? And you could lose, like, what I mean is, if you were intrinsically motivated first, extrinsic motivation, money was, let's just say money was, you're paid to do the thing. Yeah, actually, yeah. You were paid to do the thing that you were intrinsically motivated by. If you stop being paid, would your intrinsic motivation that you had before not exist, or like would it be decreased? Does that make sense? That just that question, not saying whether that's true or not. And then is it intrinsic motivation if you have expanded your definition of self, and so you're doing stuff for your expanded self, right? But to other people, it looks like you're doing it for other people.
I think like the first thing that comes to mind for Gary's first question is like kind of what Mryan was talking about, like school. Like I think it's intrinsic motivation to be a learner and to learn things, but then I think that's like corrupted by the sense that schools will be like, oh, like if you study this thing that you might not actually be interested in, but if you study it really hard and you do really well, like you'll be assigned a really high letter grade. Like, and to think that that's the reward, Ashley's point, is really weird. But yeah, like that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. And the idea of like college too, like you could just want, again, the same thing, to be a learner, but it's like you can profit off of the fact that you get into a really good school, but that doesn't satisfy your wanting to learn, even though that's assumed to be the reward. Sorry.
I was gonna say, Noor, that was the exact example that my mind went to, is that like little kids, I think, are naturally incredibly curious people, and we like break that out of them, of like these are the core subjects that you're supposed to care about. I don't care that you like those Legos at home. Don't bring those to school. Don't do X, Y, and Z. Like things like that, where eventually you've produced a child that, when they graduate, that they don't know what they're interested in because it's been like beaten out of them essentially to be interested in other things. And I think in a lot of like, this reminds me to just like of our conversation about like social media and all that stuff too, where I wonder how the existence of social media and like the internet, where our lives are more public than they've ever been, if you inherently seek more like extrinsic like validation from other people because it's so accessible. Like there's probably a time where like you just had to do something because you liked it and like no one else is going to know about it. But now it's like people know about the things that you do. So yeah, that's just another thought there.
Great thoughts. I just wanted to pause for a second. Lillian, do you want to quickly introduce yourself? Just like name, location, school.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lillian. I use she/her pronouns, and I live in the Minneapolis area. And I go to Benilde St. Margaret's in St. Louis Park.
Thank you.
Okay. One thing that I was like thinking about, Zoe, like after you were talking about that, was like, at some point, do people not even recognize the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation because it's so intertwined? Like you might think that it's something that you want, but you don't. Like I guess like I think like what you were talking about, like kids as being like this pure form of like, yeah, like they want to do things just because they want to do things and they don't have like either like societal pressure or like other pressures to like really influence their thoughts. But I think like now some people might not even be able to like identify what it is that intrinsically motivates them because they just don't know, because it's like they've never been able to like explore that, or they've never had the opportunity to, and like they didn't even know that they weren't being intrinsically motivated, if that makes sense. Like I feel like so many people like just, if they just went through school and they didn't like question things, like they might not have ever had the opportunity to be like, hey, wait, this isn't even what I want. But I think it's weird to think that like people wouldn't even know what is intrinsically motivating them, or worse, that they would think that they're being that like what they're doing is what they want to do when it might not even be so.
Something, Noor, you go ahead. Okay. Something that came to mind, Maryam, while you were talking was how our biases create our values, and in that, that creates our motivation. So I don't know, maybe it's our personal biases about the world that can, and not biases with a negative connotation, but like with just a neutral one, about how they can create our values, and then from those values, our motivators. And when I think about that, I thought about power as an example of an extrinsic reward. But when someone first starts, they might just want to be a volunteer, then they want to run for public office because they really do want to help people. And that's like intrinsic motivation because they love people. And that goes back to how Gary said they've expanded their definition of self. And from that, power might be something that, like Ashley said, is a tool, but it can also be corrupted in a sense. So I don't know, that was just an example of how that question could play out in real life.
And this brings up another question, which I will like inherently, like I'll answer as well, because I've read into this a little bit, of just like what's more effective, intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. And from the reading that I remember, when you're intrinsically motivated, you produce better products because you just honestly want to do it. But extrinsic motivators are more consistent. So like you're more likely to get a group of 100 people to do something if you say, I will pay you $100 to do it, versus, if you ask 100 people to do something and you don't pay them, you might get like 10, 15 who are really into it, but then no one else will. You kind of get two different situations with that.
What interests me is the idea that like when I think of I feel like I keep coming back to the school example just because it makes like most sense in my head, but it's like when I think about doing homework versus like doing any type of learning with CU, like, and I feel like I've said this before, but it's liberating because like I know that it's not like I know that what I'm learning can benefit other people, whereas like me learning how to calculate like a derivative, like that only benefits my grade. Like, especially considering like I don't necessarily want to pursue a career in math. So like, it's just interesting to me. And another thing that comes to mind is like the idea that if you like, I feel like everyone's always like, oh my God, like, why would you want to go into art? But if you have that intrinsic motivation of like, I'm just really passionate about it, you're almost taught that like, unless there's extrinsic motivation, there's no purpose in going into it. Like, unless there's money involved, unless like you're going to get that sense of power, it's not worth it. And so I think it's interesting how like that changes or like influences what we decide to do.
Anyone want to answer any of the questions or pose another question of their own?
I have a question.
Okay.
Can intrinsic and extrinsic motivation really be compared? Like, are they similar enough to like host a conversation on that comparison, or are they on two different scales because of how because of where they come from and how we use them in our life to do and accomplish goals?
Such a great question. I think when people treat them as like two poles or like opposites, it's like they're using that framework as a tool, but sometimes they take the tool as reality versus like recognizing that there's so many nuances, and in some ways they're independent, in some ways they are dependent.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And Zoe, I think about what you said about like, you know, like when you're intrinsically motivated, like you produce better products, but like extrinsic motivation is a lot more consistent. And like, I think even in my own life, like, yes, I am like very intrinsically motivated to like, you know, say like my like cultural change work. Like, I love doing that. But like I create extrinsic like motivators for myself. Like when I like accomplish X, I will like let myself like, you know, I'll like treat myself to like Starbucks or something. Like I don't know, but like I like create those extrinsic motivators to keep me on the right track because it is so much more consistent. Like even though like I know like yes, intrinsically I will like be very driven to do this, like it's so helpful for me to like have outside things that I can also depend on. Or like I will like tell my family and my friends like I'm setting this goal so that when I do reach it, like I'll kind of get some sort of validation from them. And it like helps keep me on track. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing or it like corrupts my intrinsic motivation. I think it actually like supports it.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think that's why like accountability partners and like what we do in our juntos is so important, because it's like you have the intrinsic motivation to do something, but you also have like the consistency because you have the extrinsic. Wow.
I mean, I think it's just proof that you need both. Like, I think that if you do things in life and you are never validated by anybody else, you will just burn out. But I think at the same time, if you do something purely for money, purely for some other person's validation, you also burn out. I think you have to have a balance where you both really, really want it, but you're also getting rewarded for it, so it feels more meaningful. And I think like what Gary said, that sometimes they're independent and sometimes they're very dependent of, you know, you'll start getting to like an end of like extrinsic motivation where it's like, I'm now doing something I don't like to do. And that's when people quit their jobs because they're like, I'm doing something that I don't actually really love to do. So I think that and also at the same time, people can go down an intrinsic motivation path and they're like, I cannot make a living for myself. I need to, you know, recalibrate based off of extrinsic factors. So I think that they keep, if it's in balance and in harmony, they keep each other in check. But I think they both like can serve to make you happy, just in a variety of different ways.
And I think that's a really good point, Zoe. By the way, I'm Chabu. I'm 19 and from Toronto, but sorry for joining late. But I think to answer that question, it really revolves around when do you know which is the appropriate one to deploy or to focus on the most when it comes to intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, because they are both valid and have so much added value, but there are times where you need to prioritize one over the other. And that's like a skill set in its own right.
Just want to say this is a very powerful group.
Any other responses to any of the questions or other questions?
I guess to Chabu's point, I'm almost wondering, like, how do you make yourself intrinsically motivated? Like, is that something that would happen naturally, or is that something you can do for yourself? Because I feel like when I need to motivate myself, again, with the example of school, like, it has to be extrinsic in the sense that, like, I learned this in middle school. It was like, oh, when you finish the end of the paragraph, like, you get a gummy bear, and it's like, it's weird, but it like works, and then I'm done with the essay. So it's like, are you able to, like, I guess to know like which one to deploy, it's like, are you even able to choose that or make that decision?
Well, so Noor, I can, I mean, this it's taken me a long time to really understand, but you have to convince yourself of things, right? You kind of treat your personality sort of like a bunch of, like, a community of like sub personalities. Is like, I don't know if I should do this. It's like, you got to convince me, right? And so the way that I convince myself to do something like running, I'll write out why running is valuable. I'll like make sure I absorb it myself, and maybe I'll look at it again and again. Maybe I'll put a Post-it on the wall that says running is like good, running helps, and and then over time it's like my association with running is like all good things. So it doesn't take I think convincing yourself is a lot more. So a few thoughts here. You need reasons to for like intrinsic motivation is fueled by good reasons. Those reasons should, at least in some way, come from yourself, by like writing it out for yourself, not just like blindly absorbing other people's suggestions. Because I mean, I'm sure like I've been trying to convince the Nasi to work out with me for about 1.5 years. I'm pretty sure he won't until he. This is giving me ideas. I think maybe I'll give him a journaling exercise or something.
So I think that's so cool, because I think I do something a little bit similar, especially when I'm like not motivated to do something that's important or super relevant, or I went through like a working slump and I'm trying to get back in the groove. Before each task on my to-do list, I'll like sit down and like free write for 1 minute as to why this is an important thing to do. Except the way that I like to frame it is that I'm like reconnecting myself with my intrinsic motivators, because I think that people forget that there can be something that you are intrinsically motivated to do, but you can still like procrastinate it or not want to do it. So I think that there's like a good relationship in just like almost like reconnecting your current activities, or like, small and kind of annoying things that you have to get through to achieve your bigger goals, by reframing it and reconnecting it to your intrinsic motivators. Because intrinsic motivators are often goals that take like a long time to achieve or accomplish.
Wow, I love that idea.
I was gonna say, that's definitely something. Oh, sorry, Ashley, were you? Oh, I was gonna say, that's definitely something I'm gonna have to try. And I think that you do have to convince yourself, but I think that it's almost like you start to become more intrinsically motivated, and you have to convince yourself that extrinsic motivators aren't doing it anymore, or like you have to just distance yourself that like that's not why I want to do it, and almost reframing it. And the example that comes to mind is that first of all, fourth grade me, I was like 9. I was a bit of a character, But like my mom used to check like the grade book every night and tell me like, these are the things that you have to do. And like, Zoe, did you do all of these things every night? And she always tells me that at some point at 4th grade, I was like, Mom, I don't need you to look at my agenda anymore. She was like, what? I was like, don't tell me what I have to do after school because I am going to do it by myself. And she was like, okay, hands off. And she's not like checked anything ever since, which is not the way it's gone with my brother. Like my brother's just not that same person. And so I attribute that to, I think 9-year-old me was just annoyed that my mom kept asking me what I had to do. But things that simple can make you more intrinsically motivated. I mean, it's almost like, I mean, people, like there are a lot of like organization and things that get started because people are frustrated or mad about something. And then they create these like incredible prolific things because they were frustrated by something. So it's almost like when the extrinsic motivators stop working, there's like something that kicks in and you start almost like fixing the problem yourself. I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it's so cool how you've like brought the connection between personality traits and our intrinsic motivators, or what becomes an intrinsic motivator because of like personality traits.
And on that note of what Chabu said about like our personality, I think it also depends on what you value. Something that I actually learned at DICE is that it's not about success. It's not really like about that end goal. It's about fulfillment in order to reach. I was just learning about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and everything, but in order to reach self-actualization, it's about fulfillment. So it's not really about like what you value, but like how, sorry, words. It's not really about what you value, but it's like about reaching fulfillment, reaching that self-actualization in order to be a better human. And I mean, that goes back to like the expanding the definition of your sense of self, because you can't really do that until you have fulfillment and you've reached all those parts on the like triangle of needs. So yeah.
Phoebe, that's my experience. I don't know. I sort of how I visualize it is like, yeah, I had to get to my pyramid for my very individual self to like even have the mental space to think about broader self. And this is why like at CU, we've kind of consciously tried to reshift what everyone, well, starting with builders, realize is valuable work, right? Working on what you can work on, what you have the capacity and you should work on yourself at the smallest scale, at the scale of the self that you can actually manage, right? And once you've managed that, right, and found, I guess, equilibrium, I was jamming with Ashley about this the other day, then you can try to help establish a healthier equilibrium, let's say with your, I don't know, partner, or situation with your siblings and parents, right? And then maybe some student groups, and then maybe like eventually you care so much about your city that you run for mayor, right? But if you don't figure out how to get a smaller scale of self in equilibrium, in a healthy, sustainable equilibrium, it's very hard to want to, I guess, grow the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Almost, it's like you have a little triangle, then you like make it all bigger. I don't know.
Like on the note of equilibrium, I also want to latch on to something that Chabu said earlier about how like a lot of like things that you are intrinsically motivated to do are like long-term things and they're like almost never over. And I feel like that, like it's almost like harmful to feel like you always need to be working on things that you are intrinsically motivated by. And that if you aren't, like you're lacking intrinsic motivation or something like that. Because I don't know, I just like, I feel like there is a balance that needs to be found, where like intrinsic motivation doesn't necessarily mean that you're working like 24/7, and that is like the only thing you can think about. I think like there needs to be some form of like widened definition of like what you can be intrinsically motivated by.
I think that Ashley just inspired a question that I have. So I know that we all kind of have like a preference or leniency towards intrinsic motivators because they have so much added value, but what are some dangers that come with that? And I can start off by saying, like in the context of like democracy reform, I care so much about that. I am most certainly intrinsically motivated to see like, you know, good things come out of the work that we do or any work associated with politics or development. So when I'm like working on a task where I'm intrinsically motivated in relation to that and it doesn't like go as planned or isn't as successful as I would have hoped, I'm like devastated, you know what I mean, on a very personal level and personal capacity. So like all good things also have like their nuances that we need to be wary of. So like I wonder if you guys have anything to add to this question.
The first thing that comes to mind is like, it's not even like overworking yourself. It's like zoning so much in on that you forget that like other stuff impacts the work you could do. So like if I was really focused on like getting something done and I didn't like journal for the day or I didn't go for a run, then it like, because I think that I'm so focused on getting this done that like I don't focus on the other stuff that also needs to get done so that my original goal can actually happen and like be successful. So like I almost, if I'm very intrinsically motivated by something, I almost forget about the other stuff that I need to do to keep that motivation healthy almost.
And to latch onto what Chabu said, I think intrinsic motivation can even be more harmful than extrinsic. I don't mean to like compare them, but I mean intrinsic motivation has to do with your own sense of self, your own sense of self-worth, like how you view yourself. And I mean, if I make a bad grade, I can just turn off my computer and go on TikTok and forget the school exists. But like if my own values or like my core being is shaken or messed up by me not being able to complete a task that holds value to me, I think that disrupts your state of mind and your state of being, and that's even more important and has more ramifications on other people as well as yourself. So I think that's why it can be even more harmful.
Yeah, I think like expanding on that, like I definitely relate because I feel like the work that we're doing comes from such powerful motivators, but it also means that it's like it can be very draining at times when like things don't go the way that you want them to go, because if you're being motivated by saying like, oh, I want to like help refugees because like they're dying or they're in horrible like you know conditions, and then you don't like you're not successful in your work, then you're like, oh well, like who are you letting down, right? Because like if your work is motivated by that, then it can also take like a very personal toll on you when like your work isn't successful. And I think like something that also just kind of like makes me think of is like if you are like intrinsically motivated to do your work, like how do you find that like work-life balance? Because like Noor is saying, I feel like things can also like fall to the side that would like help you maintain a healthy balance when you're like so motivated by like your intrinsic motivation. So it is like extremely powerful, but that can be in a good way, like fueling yourself, but it can also be in a bad way when it like overtakes some of the positive aspects as well.
It's a really good question.
I think so many of these answers just reaffirm something Phoebe said earlier, which is just that intrinsic values are a direct correlation of like what your personal core values are.
And I'll say with like work-life balance, I think you have to force it. Like I think when you, like I guess to use what Gary was saying earlier, when you've like completed your little pyramid and you're starting to expand back out to like help other people, which especially like, you know, with Maryam's example, if you're helping people in like humanitarian crises, broadly defined, there can be a lot of like personal weight with that when things don't go as well as you hoped they would. So I think that you have to have some like fun extrinsic motivators to do like other things. So I know that one that's been interesting is that like I've not always been someone to like take weekends off. But since like my mom has moved to Virginia and she comes home on the weekends and then she has to work during the week, like I now take weekends off because it's like that's the time I get to see my mom. And I was like, whoa, it's weird that, you know, this other like little kind of, you know, you can call it extrinsic because she's like, Zoe, get off your computer and come spend time with me. But also like I do want to see my mom. But you know, it's like little like extrinsic things that like force you to like take a step back and like, you know, focus on like your little small world before, you know, like kind of looking at more big picture. Which I think those can be created by other people, but you can also create it. It can be as small as like, I go to Starbucks on Saturday mornings, like what Ashley was saying, and I will spend 2 hours just listening to something that I want to listen to or reading a silly book because that's what I want to do.
Just based off of what Zoe said, I'm realizing that like a lot of my extrinsic motivation comes from like the people in my life. Like not much of it is stuff that I put onto myself where it's like, if I get this done, I'll do this. It's more like I want to get this done for someone else, or like maybe just like the fear of disappointing someone else if I don't get it done. Which like I don't know how healthy that is, but like it works. So I don't know if I mean, I just as like a reflection moment, I'm wondering if like that's something I would need to like reassess because it feels problematic in the long run.
I definitely align with what Noor just said. Being very motivated by friends and not wanting to let anyone down. I think that's probably my biggest fear, like a fear of failure. Oversharing a little bit, maybe. But that goes back to another point about how, like, I choose friends in my life who make work not feel like work, but it still is. Like we literally had a whole conversation about personality tests, and from that there was a hidden brain episode about how your personality test can be a guideline but shouldn't be what you swear on like the Bible or anything like that. And then we have conversations on that and it helps us grow. And so I am intrinsically motivated because I don't want to let them down and be like, oh, I didn't listen to the podcast. I had nothing to add to this conversation. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like work anymore because I genuinely enjoy being around them and they bring so much light to my life. But also, I know a lot of people listen to music while you're working and stuff. So I always try to work meditation podcasts, like 5 minutes into my playlist and stuff, in order for me to take that 5 minute break and meditate a little, but like still be working, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Wow.
I feel like to an extent, like if you are intrinsically motivated to do your work, like you are also somewhat like intrinsically motivated to keep a work-life balance because that is how you remain like able to do your work. And that is, I don't know, like I feel like when you don't have that balance, like you no longer have capacity to do your work anymore. And so that is like in itself like built in, like you should prioritize balance so that you are able to do what you want to do.
Ashley just articulated something that I think I'm just recently realizing is super important. That like refueling takes shape in more than just like sleeping and eating and working out. Like it also means putting your mind onto things that are not necessarily productive, but like bring you joy in some capacity or another. So intrinsic motivation and work, I think that it's hard because you don't see like your relationship with work as like a negative thing, which would normally cue you to go take a break. But it's still super important that you take those different, like you don't rely on typical cues or red flags to remind you to take a break.
Something that came to mind when Chabu said that is that that quote that's like, too much of a good thing isn't good for you, or too much of a good thing is still bad. And definitely, if you love what you're doing, being able to stop doing it, you don't feel like you can, because why would you want to stop doing what you love? But balance is so important on your journey to fulfillment and on your journey to self-actualization. And within that, there is validity and there is value. So having that balance is super important.
Yeah, snaps for that. I've also been thinking a lot about like having multiple selves, and like I think in the past, like there was like that was like very productive, and like that like took care of her mental health, and they were like separate people, and like I like yeah, just like very much separate people, like they didn't was like we're not the same person. And I think I've also kind of found that, you know, like they can't be separate people, like they need to be the same person, and like you have to find ways to like merge the two of them to truly like, I don't know, like find that sense of higher self that Phoebe was talking about.
I think like what's so spot on about Ashley's point is like, at least for me, it's not even just like, oh, past Noor did this, that was really good, or like present Noor is doing this. It's literally like, and this is like, I think that there are like, because of how complex we are, it's not necessarily that we're like multiple different people. It's that like there's like almost little voices in your head that do say different things, or like that do remind you of different things. And so in terms of finding that balance, it's like it's recognizing that not only are they like, they're individual people, but they work together because they're still like you, right? And like it's just so interesting to me to think about, because I'd almost argue that like my inner monologue is where most of my intrinsic motivation comes from, because she's very like, get it done, like because you're passionate about it and on your own time, and she's very like relaxed. Whereas like I'd almost argue my personality finds extrinsic motivation, because it's like, if you get this done, someone will benefit, or like something other than you will benefit. Which is just interesting, like to make that connection.
And that goes back to what Gary said earlier about expanding your idea of yourself to like others. I'm not gonna lie, I don't completely understand that. So if anyone would want to expand on that, I would love that.
Ashley, I know you've done some at least recent thinking about that. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah. At least like when I think of expanding your sense of self, like my definition of love is expanding your sense of self. And I think like it's really about just recognizing that you know, like everything is just so interconnected, and what you feel like are your successes aren't necessarily your own, right? Like shaped by so many people who have come before you, but also like people around you, like humans, like other living beings, just like the universe in itself is like just so complex and beautiful, like when you think about it. And yeah, like I think like expanding your sense of self is just really recognizing that when you make decisions, like it doesn't just affect you, like it affects like literally so many people around you, and everything is interconnected. I know I'm going in circles, but yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Thanks, Ashley. That made a lot of sense. And then Noor, going back to what you said about how there's like different versions. Well, Ashley and Noor, going back to what y'all said about how there was different versions of you, different voices that all contribute to who you are as an individual. Do y'all think that your sense of self is impacted more so by one aspect of your life than the other, or how have you found, oh, it goes back to that work-life balance, but just how did you find balance in that? Or did you find a common similarity in the fact that you've always been intrinsically motivated? Like Zoe said, how she was 9 and didn't need her mom checking her stuff anymore. Those were 3 questions, but it's okay. It's cool.
I also have like, but going back to what Noor said, I have like almost like a running joke of like these the 3 distinct versions of Chabu, so to speak. And I think what it allows me to do when it comes to like intrinsic motivation or decision making is that it allows me to like shift my priorities or qualities about myself that resonate with like what I'm dealing with at the moment. You know what I mean? So it's like a really easy way to almost like switch a part of your brain and be like, okay, so this is like, this is the thing that matters the most among many things that matter a lot to me. Or like, this is like a core value or motivator that's taking shape right now.
At least personally, like I'm still trying to like figure out like what the different, like I keep referring them as like people because they're as complex as like people are, but I'm trying to figure out like what they're doing, like what they're saying, and like when they come into play, and B, like after I figure that out, like how can I actually make a balance? Because like I'd argue I like I use the wrong people at the wrong time. Like I'll like, it's like, I don't know, that sounds weird, but like I'll bring out the wrong like Noor at the wrong time, and then like my priorities aren't like straight or balanced. So
And do y'all think that when the version of Noor or when the version of Chabu, like when those versions come out and they're ruling who your actions and what you do you think, not trying to say y'all have like split personalities or anything, but do you think they each have different values, or are the values like still continuous? Do they still align, or are different values more important than others in different parts of who you are?
I'll say that my different selves almost have different values, and because of that, their goals are different and like their intrinsic motivations are different, and that is what like frustrates and confuses me and like drains me, because it seems like multiple people are pulling me in multiple different directions. I don't know, but I guess like in that sense, intrinsic motivation is almost something that is like, I don't want to say dangerous, but I feel like for some of myself, like I don't question that intrinsic motivation, and I kind of just accept it as what it is. And so like that's why so many different versions of me persist, even when like I don't necessarily want it to.
I think that this conversation has opened my eyes that like I've realized, like, I mean, there are probably multiple, but I know that one particular version of Zoe is just like a know-it-all and just likes to be right. And I try to think back to like, why did I still do high school debate when I'm not at that school? Do I have time for that? Yet I find myself making 5-6 hours a week to do all of this research. And I was like, that's because I like being in a debate where I can just tell people they're wrong. And so I think there's sometimes, which is like, that's a very safe way to like express that part of my personality, because it's a competition. You're supposed to be that way. But yeah, I think that version of Zoe has very different values and is a lot like just meaner, just like not a great person to be around. Yeah, she's right, but like you don't have to go that far with it. But I think you have to like satisfy like other parts of yourself so that they don't show themselves at other times, like with other people and things like that.
Something I almost want to do before, because I know earlier we were talking about like writing down like the benefits of doing something while you're doing something. And like I almost want to do that and then compare like the different stuff I do and like whose voice comes out with that. Like almost like color coding, like, oh, this is something like I don't know, like like Zoe, if you were about to like do something with debate, like it would be very clear that like Zoe who needs to be correct and like who is correct is like translating that reflection versus like another part. Yep. I don't know, that's just something I would find like interesting to see. And I also think it's like, again, not to sound crazy, but it's like which voice is like loudest, like who talks the most, or like who doesn't get enough talking. Just again to maintain that balance, to make sure that it doesn't like come off as rude if that voice needs to say something.
I think that.
Go ahead, Chabu.
I just wanted to say that I think that the reason why a lot of us have the inclination to almost like divide our personalities into parts is because it helps you boil down to like simple truths and bring those to the surface, and then it's so much easier to like make decisions or engage in something, you know what I mean? And then also just like prioritize different intrinsic values that you have at that point in time. So there's like reasons as to why we kind of all gravitates towards doing that.
Something that I thought of when Chabu said that was that episode of NPR's Hidden Brain, The Sorting Hat. It was talking about Harry Potter and the Potter houses. And I know nothing about that, but it was super interesting because it was talking about how human beings want to be able to categorize their personalities not because we want to limit ourselves, but because we want to feel that sense of community. We want to feel like we belong. And I think that goes to like something that I think is at the core of every person. Even if you work against it as hard as you can, even if you grow and develop, fear is still a deep part of the human experience. And so I think another part of being intrinsically motivated would be fear. And I know that's something that's common with all the versions of Phoebe, fear of different things, but still fear in itself. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna stop screen sharing, and now we can just kind of talk about how that went for everyone. Some closing thoughts.
Gary said at the start of this that this is like a powerful group of people, and like I think this conversation very accurately represented that. It's always like really cool. Like it's cool to like talk about this, but it's also cool to be able to say like there are multiple voices in my head without someone like getting concerned, but like rather someone like actually relating and understanding and adding more. So.
Yeah, I'll just say like, oh wait, no, Zoe, were you gonna? Okay, I was just gonna say like I love groupthinks because I feel so like validated on one side, but also so challenged in my perspectives on the other side, just because like I like knowing that people are going through the same things as me, but also challenging me to see things from different perspectives. And like I don't know, like in ways I never even thought of approaching a topic before. But yeah, I just always appreciate talking to y'all and hearing your experiences too.
I was gonna say at first, I know that Gary like told us what the topic was, and it didn't click until we started talking about it. I was like, I did a project on this. I was like, I know about this, but I learned a lot. And I think even coming to the realization that like, like debate Zoe is like, that's a different version of me, and she has very different intrinsic motivations, and they're good sometimes, but terrible other times. Was like a really like I've always like thought about it. I was like, I'm just a totally different person when I debate. And I'm like, no, like that's okay. Like that's a different me that I don't have to emulate in all parts of my life.
Normalize having multiple voices in your head and having different personalities at different times. I mean, we all do it. We all. But something Maryam said reminded me of a SZA lyric that says, say no to the yes man. And what it means, well, y'all can probably deduce what it means. But what it means is that like say no to everyone who just says yes to everything that you say. And I think everyone in this case would be like myself. I would definitely agree with myself 100% of the time because it's my own head. But when being here with all you amazing people, saying thoughts out loud, again, very much challenge, very much seeing things from a different perspective and learning new things. And I think that contributes to my journey of self-actualization and trying to become a better person. So thank you so much for this experience, definitely.
I am also in like the similar vein as Zoe about the fact that like I did a whole research project on this for a semester on just like education and intrinsic motivators in students. And so I love how like I came to this conversation with like the internal dialogue of, oh, like I know what we're talking about, and then walking out of it with like a completely different understanding of something that I literally took months to learn about. So this was so cool and so meaningful. And I think it just speaks to the value of these conversations.
Well, Chabu, I feel like I've learned from you the power of valuing learning that isn't stuck in a textbook. I think there's the amount that you can learn. Well, it's kind of infinite from people that are intrinsically motivated to support your well-being, and be candid and vulnerable, like Zoe was in talking about that little competitive, and it's good to be competitive, the energy inside.
Any other closing thoughts?
This isn't really a closing thought, but Gary, I think the point about like voices being an energy is cool to think about, just because like that's like that, like they're literal like propellers for me to either do something or like stay away from something. That's like an interesting. I just think it was like an interesting way to put it.
Well, and just to add on to that. Yeah, I mean, this kind of full circle. We were talking about how good versus bad is subjective, and I think it's context specific. When you're there's some instances, often for survival's sake, where you have to be really assertive, right, and unwavering and fierce, and all these things. So like whatever Zoe's sub personality that she was talking about, you don't want to discard that, right? You don't want to just like stifle that. And I would almost say like, well, probably everyone has something like that in them, I think. And you just got to be aware of what goals you're trying to achieve and what personalities are going to shine and be most kind of helpful for that. So with CU, it's like almost entirely like the loving and caring personalities for me, right? Like I have to like bring that out. And the way that I shut down the really competitive zero-sum side is I work it out in the morning. I like do a strenuous workout where I can just be kind of zen throughout the day, and like little things that would otherwise annoy me a lot less. And this is actually a very common thing that a lot of people do. So it's just something to think about. Madison, you want to do the final thoughts?
Oh yeah. I just think something that I've realized is like, if you leave a groupthink without having like a completely different perspective on the topic, then you weren't listening. Just because I was just like so surprised at everything that I heard, and just how intertwined intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are. So yeah, it was super good to hear from all you guys. Thank you guys for sharing, and thank you all for coming. I hope to see you all again at an upcoming groupthink.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.